I'm going to do is really put in front of you, I think, a number of provocations and questions. And the first question I have to ask us as a gathering is, why are Steve and I up here so early in the morning? And if you think about the role of keynote speakers, generally our job is to offer you some key messages, some issues that you need to hold top of mind as you work through a meeting, through a workshop, and through a conference. And so the first question we need to be asking ourselves is, what might be those key messages that we have to hold in our mind as we work through the next 3 days in this very beautiful setting? So what is the purpose of our conference? Because that will help us winnow out what are the important messages. And when I looked at the PECS 2015 website, I was told the following. This conference focuses on the scientific and policy-relevant knowledge of socio-ecological dynamics needed to enable a shift, and that's my emphasis, towards the sustainable stewardship of socio-ecological systems in the Anthropocene. Now, I'm absolutely certain there isn't a single living being outside of this room who'd understand that. But gratefully, when my letter of invitation arrived, there was an explanatory email which helped me as a local government official understand what the organizers anticipated I might do up here on the stage today, and that was clear. It was focus on the challenges and opportunities in operationalizing sustainable development in practice. So when I thought about what the organizers might want me to do, I determined they probably wanted me to present some kind of substantive analysis of the work that I and my team, many of whom are sitting kind of in the middle ground of my view, do on biodiversity, climate change adaptation, and resilience issues in the urban environment. But that little word shift really worried me. It kind of niggled here somewhere at the back of my head. And if we're serious about wanting to shift our discourse around socio-ecological systems, if we are serious about our need to shift those systems into a new mode of operation, I really didn't think doing the kind of thing that I do on a day-to-day basis, which is talk about my work either in Durban or nationally or internationally, was going to be a particularly positive contribution to these 3 days. So I threw away that email and decided to do my own thing. So what is that own thing? What I did is I took a page out of the book, or perhaps more accurately a brick out of the wall, of my favorite graffiti artist, Banksy, who comes from Bristol in the UK and really hit the street art scene in the 1990s. And I adopted with fervor and joy one of his key memes, which is keep it real. And so I reimagined my role in the context of these 3 days to be one of those people who, as we engage, and Steve has indicated this, in quite complex debates, as we engage in debates which may become quite abstract, which may become quite academic, I'm seeing my role, and I'm sure there are others in the audience who will adopt this role, to be part of a cadre of people who ensure we tether those complex discussions all the way down to reality as far as possible. And when Banksy imagines that kind of agency in the art world, he imagines that as a process whereby his art not only comforts the disturbed, but disturbs the comfortable. I'm not offering in any way to comfort the disturbed. Do you have medical aid for that? But what I am offering to do potentially is to disturb the comfortable, to shake you a little bit out of the spaces that you might feel more comfortable in and ask you questions that you may not like, you may find offensive, but that will hopefully challenge you to think about new things. Now, why is Banksy so successful as a street artist? He's one of the street artists that's really brought that form of art into the mainstream. And that's really because what he does is he practices a transgressive form of prankster performance art. He leaves socially and environmentally challenging messages in unusual places. He puts them on the sides of camper vans, on telephone booths. He puts them on urban street walls. And he's even managed to penetrate the bastions of art and science. He got into the Louvre and hung a copy of the Mona Lisa and stuck a yellow smiley face on her. He got into the Natural History Museum in New York and he put in place that poor little taxidermied rat with a spray can next to it. So really what Banksy has done, in the words of the art critics, is he's really led in the art world a red-nosed revolution right up to the doors of tradition. He's challenged everything that we think about art and the way art should play a role in society. And that's what I'm hoping to do today, is to bring a bit of a red-nosed revolution to PECS 2015. So it'll be a revolutionary type of place for us. Now, if we're serious about doing what Banksy does, so take that kind of transgressive engagement with our field and drive through our interactions here over the next 3 days a more transgressive understanding of socio-ecological systems and resilience, what I'm going to call on you to do is to acknowledge that there are many, many forms of science and that there are many ways of doing science. And if we look to the literature, the majority of that literature, you can see that we've used the traditional sciences. We've used both natural and social sciences to interpret socio-ecological systems. And quick postscript here, when I refer to science in the remainder of this presentation, I am embracing both natural and social. What I offer you today in terms of my input is that there is a new form of science. It's guerrilla street science. It's what we as practitioners are using in the real world. And I will argue in front of you today that that science is equally important in understanding the way that socio-ecological systems work, and probably more important than the traditional sciences in driving change in socio-ecological systems. The problem with this brand of science, though, is it has much more similarity with graffiti than it does with traditional science, in that it happens on the street and off the box. And it's very difficult to get to know it, because generally the only way you can access it is through the personal narratives of the guerrilla street scientists. So what I'm offering to do with my remainder of my time up here on the podium is share with you some perspectives that I've developed over a career of over 20 years. We won't pinpoint the actual number because that gives age away and we wouldn't want to do that. But to share with you some perspectives that I've developed as a street scientist over that time. So when I reflect back, and for the purposes of today's presentation, I will regard my career as a natural scientist, starting with my undergraduate training. And when I reflect back on that period, I'm perhaps surprised, but acknowledge that hindsight is a perfect science, that during the course of that undergraduate training, we were never asked to reflect on who we might be doing science for. And we certainly were never asked to think about how we might communicate science to the people who might use it. And really the almost subliminal messaging around what science was that there was a scientist, largely male. I can remember my honors interview when I indicated to the honors panel that I wanted to focus in on terrestrial systems ecology and biogeography. The very pointed questions that came from the panel afterwards with the subtext, these are courses generally done by male students, why do you want to do them? So this idea of the male scientist really going into the world and doing science to the world. You know, if I think back on my undergraduate training, I have memories of injecting rats with tritium and then taking those rats, grinding them up in a big mincer, drying them out to understand where that tritium had gone in the biological cycles. I can remember taking dozens of mangrove propagules and poisoning them with fluoride to try and figure out where the biochemistry would collapse. So a very positive, this form of science, nothing wrong with it. It has a lot to offer us, but surprised that we were never offered opportunities to think about why we were doing that science, the kind of socio-ecological systems that might be affected by that science, how that science might be relevant in that world. Gratefully, the only thing to recommend undergraduate study is it passes quickly. It leaves us behind, and we move very rapidly into the much more egalitarian space of postgraduate study. And there I learned the importance of mentors. This is something that has stuck with me my entire career. You cannot have good science, either natural or social, without mentors in that space. And I was exceedingly privileged to have my postgraduate work supervised by Professor John Poynton, probably one of the best herpetologists in Africa, who brought to the table this really eclectic mix of classical biogeography. He's a well-trained classical scientist, great guy, knows a lot about frogs. but also brought to the table this very interesting mix of philosophy, mysticism, classical music, and psychical research. And I offer as proof of evidence his most recent book. So John is now 82. He lives in London. He's just written a book published by Cambridge University Press on the works of Michael Whiteman. Now, Michael Whiteman has to be one of the most complex philosophers I've ever encountered. I simply do not understand him. He hurts my brain. But John has just written this book on him, which explores this boundary between science mysticism and psychical research. I mean, can you get more out there than that? The joy of working with someone like John, though, is that it was a very intellectually liberating experience after these very confined undergraduate studies, and really provided an opportunity to learn from someone who saw value in many forms of knowledge, who didn't believe that one form of science was necessarily better than another, and who was also very non-partisan about where science could be done and how it could be done. That was really important because it meant that John wasn't scared of asking the urban question of ecology. He wanted to know, as a classically trained biogeographer, how a city was going to impact on ecological processes, and the ecology that we as biologists that were intent on studying that ecology, interested in it, interested in preserving it. He wanted to understand the relationship between cities and nature. And that for me was a very profound moment, because it's that question which he gave me to answer, which has become the central pillar of my career. The only problem with engaging cities is they don't allow you to be remote. You cannot be distant from a city. If you want to study a city, you have to do that from the soles of your feet upwards. You cannot be complacent about engaging with urban issues. And so as I got into a field of research which looked at this relationship between cities, ecosystems, global environmental change, I physically and mentally had to wander down the hill from the then University of Natal into the city to embrace it. I had to engage the chaos of local government as part of my research. And that taught me a variety of lessons. Firstly, practical ones. This was the first time I realized that people were central to doing science, and that science might in fact be important for decision making, that grinding up of rats might have some relationship to the real world. I also learned very early on in my career the importance of risk takers. Firstly, becoming a risk taker, leaving the safety of the biology department and my constrained field work and going down and talking to these mad people who populated the offices of local government and all of the accoutrements that go with that. I learned too that risk takers don't operate in a vacuum. You can't be a single solitary risk taker and achieve anything. You've got to find other risk takers. So I had to identify people in the policy space who saw some value in science and thought that science might be valuable to policy formulation and implementation. So important to find those, to create the networks to begin to do work with. I also learned that sustaining these relationships between these risk takers really relies very strongly on building trust. If you're going to have a body of people undertaking subversive activities, you've got to trust one another. You've got to have each other's backs. What does that mean for the science partner in the risk-taking relationship? Well, it means that you've got to be available. So I very often faced the choice between giving a lecture and giving evidence at a town planning hearing. And let me tell you, every day I ran down to City Hall because that became the priority. You've also got to deliver answers on timelines that make sense to the consumers of science, and those are never in sync with your research agenda. So very often you invent the facts if you do not have them, because that's what the policymaker demands of you. Having spent many years learning biological jargon, I had to de-jargonize immediately because no one understood a word that I was using. So I had to be able to put science into plain English in order to engage with people. There were also some important conceptual learnings at this early stage of my research. I learned that I knew nothing about the city. I claimed to want to study the city, but I knew nothing about where cities originated and how they evolved. So I found myself having to read the architecture library, which was an odd thing. I mean, how many PhD candidates of biology have to read the architecture library? And that in itself broke stereotypes. That time on our campus, you were simply uncool as a science student if you put your foot on ground that an art student had walked on. And let me tell you, having spent months reading that library, you stand out like a sore thumb, because there you are as the dowdy science student amongst these cool hipster architecture types and town planning sorts. You really do stand out. You break stereotypes all the way through. And you've got to learn the language of the town planners. So having de-jargonized, I had to re-jargonize. I had to know what floor area ratio meant, what a side space was, what zoning conditions meant, what a scheme in the course of preparation actually referred to. But for those of you who have wandered outside of the norms, you will know that there is always a societal price to pay. And the first kind of negative feedback I got was in fact from fellow biologists. They began questioning me. Was something this cross-sectoral really good science? The more critical saying, is this even science? Certainly what I found amongst the ecologists of the day, a very strong anti-urban bias. Cities weren't important to ecological research. Ecology happened in the Thule block. It happened in Shishlui. It happened in Masamara. It did not happen in cities, so why would we waste our time thinking about them? As I got into the town planning space, I found there was an equal anti-ecology bias in the urban sector. The town planners didn't feel that ecology had any role to play in creating sustainable urban environments. And so it became very difficult to break down silos. John and I offered an ecology course to the town planning department for their master's program, and they thought we had come out of some biology Woodstock, that we were hippies from the far end of campus, and rapidly shushed us away from the hallows of town planning. I also found when I spoke to the ecology lighthouses, so those people who were the leading lights in ecological thinking at that point in time, they didn't think that anything worthy of the name science could be done in the urban space. And the only people who came to the fore to help me with this research and think through methodology were strange people, eclectic scientists on the fringe, not your A-rated scientists, but oddbods that no one generally spoke to. And so ultimately what I realized, that in this kind of world, given the very different priorities between science and academia and science in the real world, I was going to be forced at some point to make a choice about where I landed, because there was no space that I could do this work in a combined way. And so when democracy came to South Africa, I decided to pack my academic bags and left the school on the hill and rolled down the hill permanently to join local government. I can only say that amongst my academic friends, the horror on their face still is well remembered. And I was deeply sort of counseled about why I had spent so much time building an academic career and was throwing it all away. But really my decision drew from the kind of ethos which I think underlies this Banksy quote: "The greatest crimes in the world are not committed by people breaking the rules, but by people who follow the rules." And so what I really decided at this point in my life was that I was going to be more effective as a change agent and as a risk taker by doing science in the policy space rather than trying to do policy in the science space. Unfortunately, there were more hard lessons along this new road that I had set myself and decided to journey on. As I left the Ivory Tower and moved into City Hall, I realized a number of things. Firstly, political ecology in the real world is way more important than ecology. You've got to understand politics with the big P and the little p in order to be able to survive. I learned that perception is as powerful, if not more powerful in this world than fact, which really disadvantages a scientist, let me tell you. It isn't what you know, it's who you know. You become heavily reliant on this network of risk takers to influence the power brokers to get things done in a way that actually drives change in systems. I've learned that the policy world is deeply suspicious of scientists. They don't know why we're there or what we want to fiddle with while we're there. I learned that there are no silver bullet solutions. There are no easy answers. The questions change on a day-by-day basis, which means your answers change, which means you need to keep your decision-making options open for as long as possible. You don't want to land that decision until you can get closer to understanding what the real question is. You need to be prepared to do two jobs. In other words, fight the evil developers during the day, and then during the midnight hours, write about that for the peer-reviewed literature so you can tell people what's happening in the real world. You need to acknowledge that it's battlefield out there. It ain't pretty. There's nothing sugar-coated about this experience. But the problem with being this kind of neither fish nor fowl entity is that both sides continue to remain cautious about you because they're not certain of what agenda you might be advancing and whether that agenda is actually aligned with theirs. And so ultimately it is a difficult space to work in, but I've certainly found that there are advantages to being a change agent with no known allegiance to any side, because it allows you to work in the gray spaces in between. You're not bound by the kind of normative constraints of either policy or science. And therefore, it's easier to offer proof of concept that change is possible simply because you slide between the formal systems. And so what is the outcome of this process? Well, effectively, what I think I've evolved into is what I term to be a scientist in practice, a kind of hybrid personality that works at the edge of science, policy, and practice, and that generally makes everyone feel totally uncomfortable. So the question is, what did I do having rolled down the hill from the university into local government? I did not use science to change the system. If you think you're going to use science to overthrow these systems, get real. It ain't going to happen. But you can use science to change what is done in the system. So to give you some very practical examples, what I was able to do was to create a niche department. So here we have a local government department that focuses exclusively on biodiversity, climate change adaptation, and resilience. I challenge you to find any local government department like it. There isn't one in South Africa, and I've not bumped into one in all my travels around the world. But this is very powerful because here we have a center in local government thinking about these pressures of global environmental change in relation to urbanization in a very focused way. We were also able to create a new discourse around the types of skills that local government needs. You know, when I joined local government, you were terribly grateful if they offered you assisted education to do an honors in public administration. The thought that local government would want to fund someone studying for a PhD in science was a total anathema to the way local government functioned. But what we've been able to do is really challenge that and indicate to local government, if you want to be a globally competitive city, you need an R&D capacity. You need to understand science and the way science can be useful to you. We've also been able to create jobs that allow people to be involved in research in the government environment, and that's an incredibly powerful mix, to have that multiple skills base. It makes you capable of pretty much dealing with everything other than the end of the world. We've also been able to use the resources of local government to reach out from the policy environment back into the academic environment. We've created and funded research partnerships with our local university around biodiversity and climate change adaptation. We've been able to use the fact that we are known to be a scientific center in the heart of local government to access additional resources for the city. So when the World Bank wants to do research, or when one of the philanthropies, we're a natural partner in that space, which gives the city access to additional resources. We've also set a trend of highlighting for local government that it shouldn't be scared of experimenting and failing. Remember, local government is currently under the whip of the Auditor General and performance management systems, which are simply strangling the innovation out of our systems, and we have to reteach those systems that experimenting and failing is not naturally the end of the world. And so if I, from this sort of edge zone of the knowledge universe that I work in, were to send this particular group a variety of postcards with some key messages for consideration, what would they be? Firstly, don't kid yourselves. Science is not politically neutral. It's particularly not politically neutral in South Africa, and it's not universally trusted. And in fact, in the worst case scenarios, it's seen as a political bad. You need to be able to hold firm against political pressure. You have to be brave, you have to be wily. Quite frankly, it's ugly out there when you get your first bribe or your first death threat. In order to be able to influence your decision-making path, you've got to be able to handle that. You're going to fight the same battles over and over and over again simply because the political environment is an iterative one. Political needs and players change, so you'll win a battle this year, but you'll fight it again next year once the stakeholders have changed. So play the long game, never play the short game. Good ideas have a political shelf life. So you can introduce a good idea into these kinds of systems and they will be embraced, they'll become mainstays of policy development, but then the political universe will get bored with it and they will expect you to come up with a new motivation for your action. Very annoying, but it does require you to be innovative and constantly thinking about why it is that you're doing what you're doing. You've got to learn not only to work within the constraints of local environments, so law and policy, but to work under the radar in the grey institutional spaces. Very often, your biggest gains will come by bringing the subversive activities of this network of risk takers into play. Know that these risk takers are so essential, you cannot be complacent around them. You cannot allow risk takers just to emerge. You've got to look for opportunities to identify them and build them and pull them into your network. Know that you've got to document your own experience and actively carry that information back into the research universe to ensure better triangulation between theory and praxis. I cannot tell you the several periods of frustration in my life where I've had researchers arrive in my office and they spend hours with you and they tape record you and they take notes and they go into the field and then they write these peculiar papers that have absolutely no bearing on your experience or any kind of reality. You wondered whether interviewing someone on Mars. Recognize that there's a spectrum all the way from someone like Steve, the research scientist, to myself, the scientist in practice, that we need to train for. I don't think we should be aiming to turn each one of us into transdisciplinary heroes. I'm sure Steve doesn't want to do what I do. I know I certainly don't want to do what he does. But what we do need to do is have that spectrum and train for it. We need an ecology of revolutions. One revolution is not going to do the job, and we need smart alliances between the risk takers. So you need a multiplicity of change agents in your universe. And unfortunately, I still have to add it in. It's still tough to be a woman out there. And we shouldn't forget the gender aspect of this. If you want to drive change, people often look at the messenger rather than the message. So ultimately, in conclusion, my narrative, if I were to describe the universe I work in, is that my understanding is that in every socio-ecological universe, you have a lighthouse, someone who is the lead thinker at the center of your universe, shining light out on the remainder of the universe. That's your source of traditional knowledge. Those are the people you go to traditionally to ask the traditional questions. Could be an individual or group of people. But at the edge are these crazy streetwise players, our red-nosed revolutionaries, who benefit from the traditional knowledge, but who remain inquisitive about what lurks in those uncharted, dark, and ignored spaces. And in due course, some of those red-nosed revolutionaries are in fact going to become lighthouses in the center of their own knowledge universes. So it's really important that we remember to create a supportive environment for them so they can emerge, they can learn, and they can thrive. Because it's only that combination of the traditional and the eccentric, I believe, that will allow us to create the kind of shifts we want. So when you look out at your knowledge universe and you see those red noses on the edge, don't call in the intellectual cops to remove them, embrace them. They're an important part of the change that we need. And so in conclusion, I leave you with another profound message from Banksy. Please don't forget to eat your lunch and remember to make some trouble over the next 3 days.